Um, and then I don't know. I know this is an open session, but we've always kind of been starting with conferences and stuff like that. I'd really like to get an update on kind of the software, whether it's Augur or Grimoire Lab. And the reason I ask is because I'm really interested in how, from a software perspective, things are kind of being aligned with the work groups. You know what I mean? Because I think that's kind of an important component. So as the work groups are doing their work, and then the software is a critical component of that, those thoughts. So I'll be quiet.
Let me start, if you want, with some news related to Grimoire. So that's quite quick. First of all, we have a new tool, which is not officially part of Grimoire Lab, but is built on it, that Valerio did. And it's for analyzing source code. So it's basically taking Perceval and analyzing, that we were only analyzing meta information. In this case, it's taking external tools to analyze source code. Right now, it's computing metrics, like classical metrics like Maccabi or object-oriented metrics and stuff like that. But we intend to have backends for licensing, for instance. And it's not yet a part of Grimoire Lab because it's a personal project by Valerio, but still it's usable, it's on the net, and we have started to tweet about it this morning. And the second one is that we are progressing in the Google Summer of Code effort with Prenjal. And this week I expect to have the first generation of metrics full from the indexes. So it's going to be pretty simple yet, because it's only going to produce a couple of metrics, activity and something else with charts and all that, but very, very basic. So if you want to check, please do. Ask for whatever you may want about how to use it or whatever. And you know that Google Summer of Code is now in the final weeks. So we still expect to have something fully functional by the end of the project, but Prenjal is interested in following even after the project. So maybe we can follow up with it. And the third one is we are in the middle of rethinking about the documentation in Grimoire Lab. So a person from Adobe is collaborating with us in that as a user. So we are trying to restructuring everything. So if any of you want to join, of course, you are also welcome. That's it, I think.
What was the last part with Adobe?
About a person in Adobe who is a user of Grimoire Lab suggested to rethink how the documentation is written and restructuring some parts of it and write some new documentation and so on. Okay. And he is interested in collaborating, and we are basically rethinking that. There is an issue open for discussing that right now. And any people joining there and helping even just to discuss how the documentation should be is very useful at this point.
Okay. Do you have any insight on how Grimoire Lab is connecting with the DNI?
With what's the DNI?
The diversity and inclusion work group, or the growth, maturity, and decline? Because we talked about panels in the past.
Yeah, Daniel is more related to DNI, Yep. But as far as I know, they are still using our indexes for most of the staff, or at least a part of the staff. Remember that they are working like in 2 levels. Well, I think, George, the details much better than myself because you are following the group more. But there is this work on the metrics, let's say how metrics should be, and the other one on computing the metrics. And now that Daniel is still using Grimoire Lab for computing the metrics.
Okay.
And but I don't know the details about that. And in the case of the GMD group, all seen as well, from the Grimoire Lab point of view, what I've done is written some Python notebooks that start to compute some of the metrics from scratch. I mean, using Perceval directly to the repository and producing some of the metrics. This has been installed for like 2 or 3 weeks because I couldn't follow on. Now, during the summer, I expect to have more on this that we could present in Vancouver. And I know that Sin on his part is making Augur also produce the metrics in CHAOSS. Sin, maybe you want to comment on this.
Yeah, we have in the Augur system now, we have a dashboard that actually indicates which of the metrics that are specified in the metrics repository. And we're looking actually at the work group version of the metrics, the growth, maturity, and decline working groups version right now, and also a clone of diversity and inclusion, kind of blending them together. And so that you can actually run a metric status page, which I was trying to bring up right now, but somebody broke the build last night. But so you can see, and maybe by the end of the call, I'll figure out how to get it running. But you can see actually how implemented different metrics are, and then what experimental metrics that are not even specified yet, but have been discussed in different contexts are implemented. So we're trying to make that connection between, excuse me, the metrics that are specified, transparent in the software.
Okay, so the idea is the DNI work group has specified particular metrics that can be pulled from trace data, which Augur can get, or the growth, maturity, and decline work group likewise has specified particular metrics. And Augur would it provide a display for DNI and a display for growth, maturity, and decline, like two different tabs?
Yes, they're actually linked on the same page.
Okay.
Yeah, from the GMORLab point of view, our focus right now is to have manuscripts use the metrics in GMD for producing the first reports, which are, PDF reports and so on. Once that is done, and I hope that's going to be done in the context of the GSOC, of the Google Summer of Code internship, I hope to produce panels in the GMORLab dashboard, exactly for the same.
It would be like, this is the DNI panel, or this is the growth, maturity, decline panel.
Yeah, exactly, something like that. So, yeah.
Because I obviously I think the most consumable stuff that's going to come out of the CHAOSS project is going to be really these pieces of software, right? I mean, this is what people will end up consuming at the end of the line, whether it's represented via a panel or whether it's through a report that produces a PDF. You've still got to push the button on that piece of software. So I think just kind of continuing to keep those things alive. These are just things that were on my mind. Keeping the work groups aligned to the software, I think is ending up being the real trick here. And then the metrics, that huge activity metrics list that we keep over on the metric side of things, that's just kind of a curated laundry list of things that may or may not be relevant to the work groups. You know what I mean? So I don't know that any of the tools, whether it's Augur or GMORLab, necessarily have to point to the metrics committee list of metrics. I think it's more important that they point to the work group, the kind of the curated or smaller set of metrics that are important for those work groups.
Yeah.
I think go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, I think in growth, maturity, and decline, we've definitely started to see the need for that. And there's, I think, a good deal of work that's starting to happen. I know that for this week, we're going to talk about metadata that needs to be around each of the metrics and how important that is. But I think also getting down to what each of the metrics actually means in its quote unquote standard form is, I mean, I'm not terribly surprised, but I think it's coming to require a bit of discussion. And I think there's some work putting those specifics back into the metric markdown and definition, that once it's implemented, that there's more work to do there, because that just, an implementation simply raises more questions, it seems.
One of the examples is when we are starting to implement in manuscripts the metrics, this discussion with Daniel Herman about time series and results and snapshots is going to be very useful, because basically what we are doing is implementing classes that can be producing either time series or the final metric in a snapshot or stuff like that, which is, or tries to be exactly what we were discussing, but now with some implementation code to discuss. So maybe with time, we can go back to the discussion with some implementation and again retake it and say, well, how this corresponds to that one. So I think that is going to be useful.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, cool. Yeah, because I think, you know, when CHAOSS first started, it was kind of just kind of getting the software in place. What is the software? Obviously with GMORLab and at the time GH Data and Pregget. And then just trying to identify what metrics people like to see. But these work groups have really formed into this kind of critical juncture
Right.
Deployment. And so anyway,
I'm not suspecting for the conversations in Vancouver about this, because some of the details are maybe better deal with in person.
Okay, no, that's great. Sean, you got something?
And I don't know if anybody, can you see the screen I'm sharing?
Yes.
So essentially, I'll look at growth, maturity, and decline because it's the most well-developed right now. But this is an Augur status screen, which shows the back end, which would indicate that there's an endpoint available, and then front end, which would indicate there's a visualization available for each of these metrics that are defined by the metrics committee. And I will say that some of the definitions are not yet mature. They're sparse in the way that they're defined, but we've implemented them as we interpreted what is there.
In terms of the definition over on the markdown page?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Right, so I think a lot of them are somewhat open to interpretation yet. I mean, they'll always be open to some interpretation, but I think that window is pretty big right now in most cases. And we just show which ones are implemented at the back end and front end. So like in the case of closed issue resolution duration, we've got a back end API that's built on top of the let me see here. It's built on top of GHTorrent Plus, which is sort of a custom.
Yeah, what's that? That's you?
It's a custom view of that we've created, excuse me, off the GHTorrent data.
Okay. To
make it run faster, basically. I mean, we could pull it from GHTorrent, but it would be a very large query. And then, and you can see which ones are implemented, not implemented. And this is an automated sort of thing. And if it's undefined, somebody has mentioned it, but it's neither defined nor implemented yet.
So what does undefined mean here?
Undefined means that it doesn't actually have a clear enough definition for us to implement.
Over on the metric side of stuff?
Right.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay.
But it's a bullet list. It's bulleted out somewhere.
Okay, that's so these lists are straight from basically just the risk.md, gmd.md,
yeah,
DMD, over on the metric side of things. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And so I have to look, but I think we're using a fork from a month ago.
Those lists haven't changed within a month.
Yeah, so it's pretty close to up to date because most of the work is happening in the working groups right now, and we're trying to keep up with those changes. But because the working groups are happening across repositories, it's a little bit of a merging thing that we have to do.
Okay. This is
and you can see just like there are some like value metrics that are enumerated, but they're not yet defined. And then we have down here, there's a long list.
That's a laundry list of everything.
Yeah, but then this is the experimental are things that actually aren't defined in specific places in the metrics committee.
Yeah, like I don't recognize fakes.
But we have back-end APIs or things that provide those metrics.
So these are just kind of your own thoughts?
Well, they come from discussion with people. They just haven't made their way into having a metrics definition.
Okay, so you captured them in Augur, but they don't exist.
They don't exist on the metrics side yet.
Over in that big activity list.
Right. Okay. And I think at some point we probably want to do some work to reconcile. I mean, as Daniel German pointed out in one of our calls, the metrics that we define and the metrics that are defined in the literature. Like I think we talked last time about doing a better job of that.
Yeah, no, and I think this raises an important question of just reconciliation across the project in general. So like you have an experimental list here, great, no problem with it, but it's, as you pointed out, not reconciled with the activity list.
Yeah, and I've got one of my developers working on making this available publicly right now. It's and I think command.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And as I look at the diversity and inclusion, actually go up to the top there.
Yep.
So like Georg, you're on the DNI.
Yep, I can speak to that.
Does that list, is that in line with where you're at? You know what I mean?
Might be behind.
The list that is here right now is the one that we had put together before forming the D&I work group.
Yep.
Right.
And the D&I work group started from the ground up, defining their own metrics.
Mm-hmm.
And we are currently at a state where we have not merged yet. So we have not considered these existing metrics and put them back into the framework that we came up with.
Over on the metric side of things?
Right.
Correct.
Like
on the metric side of...
request over for the...
Well,
yeah, the work group for... Sorry.
I'm not even talking about a technical pull request. I'm just talking about conceptually the list of metrics here.
Yep.
We have not made sure that they're represented within the new framework that the D&I work group came up with.
Okay. And I would say, and we'll get other people's thoughts, but so this list here that Sean is showing, this is the list that's on the metrics dni.md. Actually, could somebody put that in the chat real fast? Yep. So this list that Sean has here in Augur for diversity and inclusion is the list that we kind of informally came up with before the work groups formed.
That's right.
This is like 6 months ago. And so this is just kind of based on our own reflections and just trying to get some, thanks, Gaylord.
You're welcome. Trying
to get some semblance of order to these categories, the diversity and inclusion category. And I tried to click on Sean's link there because he's sharing it. Sorry, anyway.
Like contributing organizations?
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, go back to diversity and inclusion. Just click on that link that Georg just put up.
Oh.
It's on the chat.
Yeah, I saw it pop up and then I looked at it and then I closed my chat. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, that. Yeah. So, so if you don't have it, so this list right here is the same list that Sean has over in his Augur, in the DNI and the Augur stuff. So can you go back to Augur?
Yep.
Sean?
Yep, working on that. I've got all kinds of, there we go.
So that list is the same as this list. And the diversity and inclusion work group has subsequently been working since that period of time. And Georg, you have a list of, I don't know, how many metrics do you have in your DNI as it stands right now that aren't these?
Sorry, I was distracted. What was the question?
So over in the DNI work group right now, how many metrics do you have?
We have, we came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 goals.
Okay.
So high level metrics, and then within each of them we have different lower level metrics that can inform them.
Yep.
So when you go to our page, you find 7 files with goal in front of them.
Okay. So I think that those goal did you use the question approach too? Sorry, I'm not over there. Okay, so you used the GQM approach. So I think at one point, the work that the DNI work group has come up with, the GQM metrics that you have, that should essentially override what we have on the metrics list that Sean showed. That's my thinking. Because that's the DNI group. They're the ones that have come up with what they believe to be important. They're the ones that are working diligently to figure out what metrics are really important. In the first list that Sean is showing here, this was just kind of bootstrap the conversation. But now the dedicated group, we should be merging that over.
Yes.
Right.
So the stage where we are at in DNI is we're not quite ready for implementation yet.
Okay.
Because we're still working our way down from the goal to the metrics.
Okay, so it's just not quite ready to actually do that. Was that what you're saying?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the metrics I've read over on diversity and inclusion's team or project group repository are, I think at this point, not yet there's not yet anything that could be produced as a metric from trace data. At this point, the goals are at a higher level and could not be generated from trace data.
Okay.
So I think, one of the things that I think might be important is if the diversity and inclusion working group decides that these metrics that have been identified are no longer diversity and inclusion metrics, I think it's clear that these metrics remain important for projects and are utilized in different ways. And so we don't want to lose these metrics that already exist. We want to put them somewhere, because I know a lot of the tools I look at are looking at new contributors, organizational level contributions, maintainers, all these sort of other forms of diversity are things that community managers do look at, in addition to however the committee might operationalize it. Or maybe the committee will include these things. I don't know. I just think we don't want to lose these measures because we know that they're used.
Yep.
Yeah, my goal is to merge them into the work that the DNI is doing right now.
Okay.
But we're at a stage before I can do that right now.
Sure,
okay.
Sure.
So then sorry, Sean.
Yeah, so I think, but if it would be completely valid if the DNI committee decided that how they want to operationalize diversity and inclusion includes some but not all these things, I would just say, throw up a flag to the larger group to say, where might these live, because we know groups use them.
Okay, so this is super helpful, at least in my mind. So Georg, the idea is potentially at least bring these forward to the work group as a way to understand diversity and inclusion through trace data. And then ultimately the diversity and inclusion work group would include some low-level metrics that could be obtained via trace data, such as these, and some that just absolutely could not be obtained through trace data, which is perhaps through interviews or surveys, but other methods that are required to understand those particular metrics. Is that right? Did I say that right?
That is absolutely correct. And if you follow the link that I posted in the chat to the project places, there you can see that within each goal, we then have these actual metrics. When you go on the documentation link, there you get an idea for where these metrics will live. And this is where then in category 4, we will have quantitative metadata metrics.
Okay. Wait, say that last part again. Not the last part, but when you say like where these live. So
when you go to project places and for
place.
example documentation.
Which
get
one?
to it.
Documentation. Okay.
Documentation.
Yep.
Yes. This is one that we prototyped out. And in section 4,
I see.
we have sample success metrics. And this is where I expect the metrics that Sean is still showing on his screen to end up. Not specifically in the documentation one, but just in one of the detail pages. That
it would be about sample success metrics, the section 4. Okay.
And that's where we can have metadata informed metrics that can be implemented.
Okay. Okay. So when I'm looking at this overall repository here, you've broken down these highest level items within their own markdown. So goal events, goal, contribution, events, governance, leadership, so on and so forth. And so if I click on governance, this gives me the lower, so that name category, the name column is the actual lower level metric.
Correct, yes.
And then within those, the lower level metrics, if it's documentation, if you click on documentation, it actually tells you how to go get, or it gives you examples of how you could potentially get access to this information.
Correct. And one of such examples could be to say, go to Augur, go to this screen and look at this data, or go to Grimoire Labs, get this dashboard, and you have the data.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. Any questions on that? It makes sense to me. I hope it makes sense to everybody else.
I mean, I had the group build this screen for us just so I could keep track of the status of things that have been built and not built, because it was getting a little bit hard to keep track of in my head.
Yeah, and this goes to that point of kind of keeping everything together.
Yeah.
I think this is where a lot of effort, maybe this is some effort that I need to put in, is just trying to make sure everything kind of stays together. And I understand there's going to be periods, as Georg is pointing out, where there is going to be a little bit of, I don't know, forking is quite the right word here, but a little bit of differentiation between what's occurring in the work group and what's actually on that metrics page. You know, the markdown files that define diversity and inclusion, or the metrics that define risk. I think we should all keep in the back of our mind how we keep these things together to the best of our
And I think it wouldn't, I mean, I imagine, because it's not I that would do it, but I think it wouldn't be hard to have a reference to the Bitergia or Grimoire Lab implementation of these metrics as well. Like perhaps, I mean, it might not be as, I mean, we have to conceptualize what that link looks like differently, but I think that there's almost certainly representations of many of these metrics, if not most of them, in Grimoire Lab, and it would be good to see that alongside Augur, just because that would, I think, give us a more full view of the overall CHAOSS effort. I mean, this was clearly, and I think transparently, just the Augur team's way of trying to keep track of this. But what we did here could be expanded.
Okay.
Because ultimately we're just reading metadata from different places.
That's quite interesting. I'm going to try to have something similar, at least for manuscripts, so that when we produce the PDF report, we can know which of the metrics in CHAOSS are represented in it, using basically your format. So I like how you are representing this, because that way you can very quickly know which part of the metrics are implemented and in which one there is work in progress and so on. So yeah. I like it.
Super duper helpful. Thank you. From a growth, maturity, and decline perspective, I know Jesus and Sean, you've been spending quite a bit of time in this work group. Are you?
Let's spend the work group where we've been spending time. Quite a bit part. I have more guilt than would allow me to actually.
No,
it always feels like less than I should be.
Well, then ramp it up.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to do.
The problem is that we decided to start, let's say, from the beginning to the end, trying to have at least some of the metrics implemented from scratch. Okay. I did a couple of notebooks, Python notebooks for some of the metrics, pretty simple ones like number of commits, showing the differences, like do you count merged commits or not, or do you count commits are empty, or that kind of stuff, so that you can see actually running the notebook on any repository the differences in metrics. At the same time, we're discussing some of the metrics that were lacking in a specific definition. So, for instance, right now I remember closed pull requests. What does exactly mean? Because you can close a pull request by merging, by abandoning, or by doing nothing. And then we have a discussion, for instance, in an issue of what exactly we are talking about here. Okay. And the idea is to come out with a very specific definition that at least we are going to implement in manuscripts. And I know Cine is trying to do the same with Augur. And the idea would be, as much as possible, to have the same definition in both cases, or at least showing the differences between those definitions. So to see, well, maybe Augur is implementing in a way which is slightly different, but we should be able of explaining why that difference and why maybe the results are a bit different because of it.
Okay.
And the problem is that this is maybe too detailed, and that's one of the reasons we are maybe too slow compared to at least what I thought when we started this one. On the other hand, my impression is that we can reproduce the whole process from the repository to the metric. And Sorry, please go ahead.
No, I think this is great. Sean, did you have a comment too?
No, I
Okay.
think Jesus covered it.
So it sounds like from the growth, maturity, and decline perspective, you're focusing on the metrics that are on the GMD markdown file over on the metric side, not necessarily coming up with new metrics the way that DNI has done so.
Not in general, but in some cases, when we look at them, we realize that we need either to refine or to change slightly some of those. If you go to the repository, to the GMD repository, you can see the current status. And you can see, for instance, how for some of the metrics related to pull requests, we have split them in, I don't remember, in 3, I think, because of the definition didn't match exactly what you find in the repositories. And that kind of stuff, but they are pretty much the same, right?
I think in the case of diversity and inclusion, that merely reflects that growth, maturity, and decline are is a metric category that's been discussed for quite a while. And the diversity and inclusion sort of instrumentation, if you will, is a very recent discussion, very recent being maybe it started 5 years ago at the most.
Yeah, the focus is way different because the basic idea on GMD is we are not going to discuss why these metrics are useful, or of course anybody is welcome to come and say I find this metric useful or this is more useful if you look at this way or whatever. But there has been a lot of work on that. So the basic idea is let's keep the metrics in general as they are, and now let's discuss about the details of how to compute them so that we can come to with a canonical way of computing all the metrics. And that's the idea.
That's super. This is a really helpful conversation for me. Thank you. So I think in the case of diversity and inclusion, I think one of the things to keep on the back of your mind, Georg, or folks that are in the DNI work group, is to take the work that you've done and make sure that that's parallel with what's actually over at the metric side of things. And I understand that there's work to do to get that done, but keeping those two things aligned. I think from the growth, maturity, and decline perspective, it sounds like it's less about keeping those two things in line. It's more about actually contributing back to that activity list to make sure that the definition of these low-level metrics like code commits, I just picked one, is defined properly in the markdown that is specific to code commits. So Sean, if you click on code commits right now.
Yeah.
Or any one of those, I don't care.
There we go. Code commits.
So it takes us here, right?
Right.
This is in the work. You're in the work group, the growth, maturity work group. I'm guessing right now.
Yes, that's right.
Yep. So so
you can see these are very sparsely defined.
Yep. But as you clearly define them, making sure that those are merged over to the activity metrics list in the metrics committee. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think one of the aspects of this is that we're probably going to have to do it'll be a little bit of it's probably just a detail, but we're going to have to separately fork the metrics repo and edit it and put these files in, just because the current growth, maturity, and decline repo doesn't include the other categories. So I think we would erase them if we did a pull request.
If you just did it on the
phase 2 is correct.
I think the only place you have to really do it, I don't think you're actually changing the growth, maturity, and decline category, but you're, as Jesus was pointing out, you're refining how we understand the particular metrics.
Yeah, if you want to look at an example, go to the examples directory, please. Sen, if you don't mind. Go to the root of the repository and
the growth, maturity, decline one.
Go to the root repo, right, and now click on examples. Look at the README, and there are several notebooks there. Click on code commits at the beginning of examples in whatever. Then you have code commits, which is the only one which is currently accepted. This is a notebook getting actual data from an actual repository. Okay. So the idea is we download the data from the repository with Perceval and upload it as a JSON file to the repository, and then we run the notebook in it. And you can see, for instance, in this case, the many different ways of understanding what count commits means with code for getting all of those.
Yep.
And then you can look at the differences and try to understand that. And our idea is with this then for hopefully all of the metrics, then we can discuss and settle on this is going to be the definition by CHAOSS.
This is great.
Find out this is the most interesting one. So for instance, in this case, maybe, I don't know, maybe we are going to consider code commits, ignoring merge commits and considering only commits that touch a file, for instance. And that's going to be a precise definition that we're going to say. But at the same time, we can also say, well, maybe for your specific project, it's more interesting that you have into account merge commits because of this and this. So that this can be, let's say, detailed enough so that anyone can realize how to use the metrics, even for doing an independent implementation of this, for instance, which was the idea. Because if you remember, we are going to provide a kind of a canonical implementation, but anyone can implement it in some other ways. But the idea would be, well, numbers should be the same because the definition should be the same.
So a lot of the definition comes from actually the source and the deployments here.
Exactly. What I expect in Vancouver is that we go through these notebooks and discuss and settle on, well, for now at least, this is going to be the definition for this and these reasons. And that's where having actual users of the metrics is quite interesting, because the actual users of the metrics, I mean, community managers, for instance, can say, well, for me, the important one is having into account merge commits or not. And based on that, we can decide whether this is the metric that we are going to produce to promote, let's say, in CHAOSS or not.
Yep. Okay. And so then this essentially source here could be contributed back to the, which one is this? Commits, code commits?
So this is one of the metrics in the GMD. So at some point, this should be reverted back to the general repository.
Yes, exactly.
With a more detailed definition, etc.
Exactly. There's a subsection of each one of the metrics called like deployments or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is I think this code is the intention, Jesus, to actually implement this code, or is the intention really to have the code represent for people a concrete implementation that helps them to differentiate between these naive versions, the empty commit ignoring versions, the only non-merge commit. I mean, essentially these are different ways of looking at commits. It's not so much that one would canonically implement exactly this code, for example, in Grimoire Lab, but that this is the logic that we can show in a concrete way that should be followed. So it makes it easier for a developer to implement in whatever tool.
Exactly, because the idea is that by writing the code, you are very specific. And this is exactly how we do that. Because in English, in some cases, you lose the details. So the idea is to have code. And of course, any implementation could implement in many other ways. But the idea is if they implement it right, the result should be the same, because the final count should be exactly the same. And that's it.
I mean, these types of contributions, not commits, but the types of contributions that you're showing here in this in this notebook, super helpful. I think it's really, really descriptive, because for a lot of the just singular metrics that we kind of have just a high level definition, like code commits. These are commits that go into the code. It's like just a sentence. There's not much to it. But then we could say for detailed description, please see source below. And I think this would really give a really rich view of what's under the hood.
My impression is that this kind of notebooks is mainly relevant to the developers of the tools. I don't expect maybe a community manager, for instance, to come here, look at the code. But if somebody wants to know exactly what we are measuring, then that's the place to go. And that's the idea.
But then the high level definition.
So here's the code commit markdown. And at the end of the day, I think that notebook that Jesus just showed us would be linked in here under either a known implementation or maybe a separate reference implementation category that would, you could go straight from here to that clarification.
Exactly. And in the section 3 formula, you probably would be saying one of the implementations in the notebook, the one that we decide this is the right one, let's say. And maybe we also need to include some other comments or whatever which is something like other ways of understanding this metric, and talking a bit in English about the different possibilities, and just linking the notebook for details, so that if you are interested in these other ways of understanding this metric, go to the notebook and you see the details. But it is to keep these two levels, right?
Can we just, why would we keep it at 2 levels? Couldn't, if you go to code commit, scroll down, Sean?
Mm-hmm.
If you went to...
The idea of the 2 levels, sorry, go ahead.
Matt, I think he's frozen.
Implementation. A lot of like nodes, would you want to the notebook, or we just want to embed that notebook here? See what I'm saying? So you have your page that you showed, which was the really rich understanding.
It's an IPython notebook, yeah, or a Jupyter Hub notebook, yeah.
But do you want, at least my first thought was that we have this markdown file, which is called codecommits.md. We have a description, which is pretty generic at this point. Some use cases.
So I think
maybe we rethink about how we start.
So I think Jesus' point, I'm going to just try to do this fast here. I think his point was, if we go to this example notebook, and he would say, we're going to decide just only non-merge commits is the definition that we're going to use for code commits. I'm not saying it is, I'm just using an example, right? And so you would essentially bring this probably this code and this text over to the markdown document under the formula.
I see.
So the formula would be, here it is, and maybe it would indicate it's in Python, and perhaps there would be a link to this notebook to see more options, or to see the discussion, or the perspectives that were considered or something. Here's the notebook link. I don't know what you think. Is that what you meant, Jesus?
If you really want to get into detail.
No, that's the idea. The idea is to have one level where people who don't understand a lot of code, or are not bothered about it, they want to know what the metric is about. They just can read plain English, and maybe have some hints for more information. And then some other place where only people really interested in understanding all the details of the metrics, how it is computed or whatever. Maybe because they are writing another implementation, or maybe because they are worried about my numbers are not exactly what you said should be the numbers, or something like that. And in those cases, they want to look at the code and the different ideas. And at the same time, the notebooks are useful for discussion, because there we can, instead of just talking about what could happen, while you go there, and you see the different options that you have for the metric. And then you can decide, okay, this is the more sensible one in this context. So that's why those are like two views. And my impression is that the notebooks are mainly supporting information. So they are not really needed for understanding what the metric is about. It's only needed if you are implementing, or if you are discussing about the details. And that's why.
Okay, no, that makes good sense. That makes good sense to me. Okay. It does make me think, Sean, can you go back to the markdown file?
Yep. Should be able to do that.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, so I always think that the list of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever the subheaders are on here, this is always kind of a moving target. I think keeping this as simple as we can, just listening to you talk, Jesus, that we have a very high level description. I don't know. I think I'll need to continue to think about this as to what we need.
I think keeping having some standard set of headings will make the collection of metrics easier for people to understand.
No, I totally agree. Yep.
But I'm not married to these headings, and we're at a
I
point
think it's mostly just whether or not we're married to these headings. Yeah.
In any case, the idea is to have some of the metrics completely written in this format, and then discuss. And maybe we can find out that this is not the right format, that we are missing something, or there is too much information, whatever. And then we can discuss. But it's easier to discuss on the specific cases than just discuss on the, on the world.
Okay, Georg just put out
shared that headings are different for DNI, because DNI had to be different, didn't they?
Yeah, we had to be special. No, there's very similar intentions behind these headings. We just named them simply, and we combined them to what made sense to our work. So
okay, so that's what that link was. That's this. You had shown us this earlier.
correct. This is the detail page, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, this helps a lot.
I think the software people are probably going to need, so sample success metrics is an interesting, project places, documentation. Okay.
Maybe this is level.
So you're,
15. Maybe
yeah, this is like a level up, like a,
yeah.
Yeah. So I think that section 4 at some point needs to be refined in these are the actual metrics that we propose. Because right now, my impression is that you are discussing metrics that could be used. And at some point, you need to say, well, these are the real metrics that we want to use.
Yeah, section 4 looks like almost a collection of metrics where the model, like if I'm just to go back to the one we were looking at where there were 4 or 5 different implementations of code commits, this might be code. If I was to put code commits here, you might actually list in this model the 4 or 5 specific types of implementation. Is that, am I understanding what the intention here is, Georg?
Yes, that is correct. We don't want to go into implementation here. This is really user focused and how to we actually use the metric.
Which I like. I actually kind of like this. Not a knock. I mean, I think they're both needed.
Yeah,
this
I
is
like it too. It's but it's, I think what's interesting is that it's saying we're not picking a specific definition for documentation. We're saying there are, let's say there's 11 ways to look at how to measure documentation, and here are samples of those 11 ways. And similarly, we would say there's these 4 or 5 ways to look at code commits.
Correct.
Examples of those.
And here's a link out to the notebook that shows how to do that.
So instead of the definition for code commits trying to arrive at a canonical place, it's saying here that it's actually raising that stuff from the notebook up to the metric definition and saying here are some nuanced ways to measure it.
I like this because I think this captures a wider, it's a wider umbrella or whatever. There's more that can fit underneath it. And so in the code commits, go ahead.
Yeah, it prevents the quick dismissal of someone who is sort of has a firm belief that code commits should be measured using this specific implementation, and they look at our metric and go, well, you're wrong. I'm done with you.
Yeah, because the top level definition doesn't align with what they want or what they expect.
But something that I like from this kind of stuff is that in the D&I group, they are starting from what do we need, which is something that in the case of GMD, you were discussing for years, but maybe it's not captured in documents like this one, where you say, in the end, we want activity because of this and these goals that we have. And then activity, we can measure it with commits and some other stuff. So this kind of files that you are showing right now on the screen seems like this is why we need this, and these are the ways that we could measure it. In the case of GMD, we have the ways we can measure it, and we have some details about why that's useful. But we don't have something like this capture where everything is together, and this is the reason why activity is important. Or maybe we have it somewhere, but not in the collective with the metrics. Maybe that's something that we can also reflect on, or maybe we can discuss in Vancouver. Because I like this way of, say, starting from the user needs and then think on the metrics. Because in GMD, it's like the metrics are done. And the discussion on why those metrics are done, the rationale, is maybe lost in this discussion that you have had for years.
Yeah,
and,
exactly. The discussion is kind of an afterthought. Like, here's what you need in the discussion. Okay.
But maybe, maybe we can try to write this level too. Maybe we can talk in Vancouver about that, to try to write this level for GMD, because I'm sure that you have it in your minds because you have been working on this for a long time. Maybe we can have this written from scratch, but from your ideas, I mean, not from scratch, from your ideas, and link into the metrics so that we have 2 more similar structures.
That would make a lot of sense. And this would then inform that huge activity list, because that's essentially what this is. These are the activity metrics.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Okay.
This is great. Yeah, started out with a simple question as to where the software folks are at and where they are. This is great. This is a lot. This is very, very clarifying for me. So thank you
for
taking
for me.
Thanks to you for asking.
Jesus, are you going to you'll be on vacation for the Thursday call this week?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not be able of joining on Thursday to the GMD meeting, not on the next Thursday either, because basically I'm leaving tomorrow until Thursday next week, right? So I will try to submit something before leaving. Otherwise, I will catch up when I come back to the next meeting.
Okay, I will maybe make a point of trying to start recording those.
Okay, thank you.
We haven't done that yet, but it's probably time to grow up and record them.
I recorded the last one.
Oh, that's right. You were there.
I was there.
Record the last one.
Yeah. Whenever I'm there, I'll record them. Okay.
Okay.
Any other things from people? That was very enlightening. Super helpful for me. All right, folks.
That's helpful for me too.
Yeah. Until next week, I guess. And actually, is next week? What is next week?
6 weeks to August.
Still the okay. So
July
it's not
21st.
an official.
Yeah,
yes,
I'll actually
won't. Official monthly meeting.
Yeah, I won't be there. Actually, next Tuesday's meeting, I won't be there because I'll be on my way to the Foo Fighters show in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Or no, wait a minute. No, I won't. I'll be on my way to DC actually for a workshop after the Fighters show the night before.
Oh, that's a great combo. Foo Fighters and then try to be intellectual the next day.
Yeah. Well, they have a song named Sean now, so
great.
I feel like the reservoir is complete.
All right. Well, till next week. I think this was great. It was really good to see everybody. Yeah. All right.
Good discussion.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.